Hello, my lovely library lions. Today I'm going to be doing my July wrap-up. I didn't get as much reading done in July as I usually do, partially because Pokemon Unite came out, I got back into The Sims, I got into a lot of virtual pet games that I used to be into, so I was spending a lot of time playing games and not really reading, but that's okay. We all have different hobbies and sometimes we can't focus on reading with 100% of our time. I still read 5 books, so I am still on track to complete my goal for the year, and I will tell you about them now. The first book I read this month was The Name of All Things by Jen Lyons. This I sort of blame for being the reason that I only read 5 books because it is pretty massive, and I was reading it right at the time that I was pretty busy, and parts of it are dry, so I wasn't super into it, and I would put it down and not pick it up for a long time. But I did really like it. It took me a long time to read, but it's the sort of book where it's a story within a story, and I love that kind of trope. I loved the characters. I loved exploring Jorat, which we didn't get to see too much in the first book, and the culture of it is amazing. It was super fun. There was all kinds of representation. It was very diverse, and I really liked the characters that we got introduced to. I really liked the multiple POVs. I liked the idea that these characters were telling their story in a bar to the main character of the previous book, and they're all meeting up for a big sort of final confrontation at the end of this book that isn't the story within the story, but is actually the main story. It's a little complicated, sort of like Name of the Wind is complicated, but I really adore this series. I think all 5 books are out now. At least the first 4 books are out in this series. I'm going to read all 5, but they do take me a while to get to and a while to get through, just because they're so big and intimidating, and they are dense reads. They're not bad reads, but they are very dense. There is a lot happening, and it just takes me a while to read them. It's maybe one of my favorite adult fantasy series out right now. It's right up there with Game of Thrones and Name of the Wind. So I really adore it, but I can't promise I'm going to be reading the 3rd book anytime soon. I don't even own it yet. But I will, and someday I'll have read all the few thousand pages of this series, but not someday soon. I gave myself a break after reading that one, and I read the My Hero Academia Vigilantes Volume 3 manga. I dropped this series for a long time, about a year, I want to say. I just read Volume 2 and I decided I'm not going to keep going. And then, as it was coming out, Aizawa got sort of an arc that was really big and everyone loved it in the fandom, and I thought, I have to go back and read Vigilantes because Aizawa was one of my favorite characters in the main series, so I have to read Vigilantes to get to his backstory. So here we are, and I actually really liked it. I liked the way that Vigilantes looks at heroism as not necessarily brightly as My Hero Academia does, though they're starting to look on the darker side as well. I like that it looks at how people are persecuted for their quirks, how people can't use their quirks, how heroism is actually just as much about popularity and people liking you as it is being a good person, and that you can try to be a hero, and if you have a bad quirk, you might still end up being sort of looked down on and not seen as heroic if your quirk is something unpleasant. And I really like the main characters in this as well. I like seeing their quirks develop because they're very simple-seeming quirks compared to what we have in the mainline story, and to see them slowly develop into quirks that can be used in multiple ways is really fun. I also really liked Captain Celebrity, which is the American biggest hero, so sort of America's All Might, and how just like slimy he is and awful. It was really fun to read. I really didn't like him, and he's going to be in upcoming volumes more. I don't know if he can be redeemed in my eyes. He's pretty gross. I was lucky again with the next book that I picked to read, which was My Lady Jane. So I read My Plain Jane first because I got it in an owl crate, and I read it a couple of years ago, and I thought that it was so funny. It was one of the funniest books I'd read in so long, and I knew I was going to read all of the Lady Janies when they announced their Mary series. I knew I was going to continue on to that, but I didn't actually get to it until now. I loved this book. It's a retelling of the life of Lady Jane Grey, and it has a few different main characters. I loved G and Edward and Jane. I loved their interactions, the chemistry between them. I liked the romance, not so much Edward's romance, but I liked Jane's romance, and I really liked the way that the characters had all these secrets, and you got to see them each in their own point of view, and you sort of fell in love with all of them, and it was really tense near the end where you thought they might not all make it, because it's a battle, and sometimes not everyone makes it out of a battle. It was really good. It was really good. I liked the way that they twisted history. I'm not a big historical fiction reader, and this is technically historical fiction very loosely. They take history and they twist it into an entirely new story with a new ending and new sort of conflict. It's now about the sort of the crown against the Edians, who are sort of magical people. Instead of being more about the church versus the crown, it's now the Ethians versus the crown, or I forget what they're called, but the people who hate the Ethians versus the crown, because they want to persecute all Ethians, and the previous king ended up being a lion Ethian. So it's pretty difficult to explain quite quickly. It's got a lot of good world building for something that's only not quite 500 pages. And I'm really excited to revisit this world in the first Mary book, which is going to... Mary cameos in this. And I didn't realize that she was going to be in this book and then the main character of her own book when they did the Mary series. So I'm really excited to return to that. And I hope that we get a cameo from Jane and G. I did get to a second sequel this month, and that was The Night Country by Melissa Albert. It was fine. I don't really like this series, I realized reading this book. I like the fairy tales within the series, and I think I would adore Tales from the Hinterland, which is the book that Melissa Albert published, which is just the fairy tales that inspired this book series. But the actual story I don't really care for. The characters all felt super flat. None of them felt like they had a lot of motivation behind them or a lot of depth. I didn't like Ellery. I forgot his name because he's boring. I didn't like Ellery's POV. I didn't like him being in the book at all. He felt pointless, and there's no chemistry between Ellery and Alice that I could see. They hardly know each other, and I didn't like the whole romance aspect. I wish they would have focused more on Alice and her friend and Daphne and building up those three characters. It just ended up kind of being a mess, and no one really gets the development they deserve, and it's very, very boring. It feels like almost nothing happens. I'm essentially just reading this book to get to the parts where they tell you the fairy tales, and I don't know if I've forgotten the first book or if we never actually hear the full fairy tale of Alice, because I don't remember it. And this book hinges a lot on you remembering the fairy tale of Alice, otherwise you can't work out sort of the twist in the book. So that was really lame, and the twist came out of nowhere for me, and I was just like, I don't remember that being part of the story. But maybe it's because I waited so long to read this, but I kind of wish I hadn't read this. I just want to read Tales from the Hinterland. I didn't need to read The Night Country. I don't know why I thought it's the Hazelwood in the Night Country. Didn't need to read this one. I should have just read the collection of fairy tales. That would have been much more fun. The last book I read this month is actually probably a contender for my favorite book of the year. It's definitely going to be on my top 10 list, and that's The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. So this is a nonfiction book. It's a little bit of a memoir, and it's just John Green reviewing different facets of the human experience, from sort of lawn grass to penguins of Madagascar to Diet Dr. Pepper. He does a lot of these reviews on his podcast, and this is sort of a collection of some of his podcast reviews and then some new reviews that have been written for this book. I thought it flowed really wonderfully for a collection of just random reviews. There was a clear sort of following a line of Green's life, and it was just, it's such a beautiful story. Maybe not necessarily a story, but the way it's written is so well put together, which I often find is an issue in anthologies or short story or essay collections, is that they don't flow. They don't feel like they belong in the order that they're going in. But John Green did an excellent job at that. It was such an easy way to sit down and just flip through and read the whole book. And he's just a really good writer. I fell in love with him in high school, and then, I kind of sort of fell out. I was like, okay, that's mostly for teens. And he writes amazing books for teens, which I still enjoy as an adult, just not as much, because as a teen, they really spoke to me. It just has so many things that I felt so deeply that I couldn't put into words until Green put them into words for me. There's so many quotes in here that I want to keep with myself and sort of store them away so that I can tell them to people and share them. So many things that I have felt before that I can now articulate in a way that I wouldn't have been able to without Green's writing. It's a book about how fragile humanity is, how temporary almost everything is, sort of that we are a speck on the great cosmos of the universe and how a lot of things feel like they don't really matter. But it's also a book about how everything matters, how things are beautiful, how important love is. And he just kind of weaves these two ideas together that you don't have to be permanent and all-powerful to matter and to have purpose. And I thought that was beautiful. I love this book. I would recommend it to almost anyone, and it's definitely going to be in my top 10, if not the top book of the year. So those are all the books that I read in July. 5 books isn't my best. I don't know how many I read last month, but I think it was 5 or 6. So I've never yet hit, again, my peak that I hit in January. And maybe I can do it in August. I'm going to do a read-along in August with a couple of people, which I'm excited to talk about next month. And I'll probably be doing a buddy read as well with one of my friends for From Blood and Ash, which I'm excited to read because I've heard so many good things and I love dark boyfriends. So that is it for this month. Please don't forget to like and subscribe below, and I hope that I see you next weekend.